You know how sometimes you wake up in the middle of the night, and for a second, you're not sure where you are? It happened to me one night, but what I saw, what I felt, still makes my skin crawl. I swear this isn't just another dream story or something made up to scare you. This was real. Too real. It started about 2 months ago. I had just moved into a small rental house in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't anything fancy. 2 bedrooms, a cramped kitchen, and an old living room that smelled like dust and old wood. I liked it though. It was simple, peaceful, and perfect for someone living alone. Or at least, I thought it was peaceful. At first, it was little things. You know how houses creak at night? Settling noises, right? That's what I told myself when I'd hear soft thuds coming from the walls. I'm not really the paranoid type, so I brushed it off. But then, it got stranger. One night I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. The room was dark, except for a dim sliver of light creeping in through the blinds from a street lamp outside. That's when I saw it. A shadow, just at the edge of my vision. It was standing in the doorway, as if it had just appeared there. I remember feeling this instant drop in my stomach, like that sensation you get when you miss a step. I blinked, thinking maybe I was half asleep, my eyes playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, the shadow was gone. I was left staring at the empty doorway, my heart pounding against my ribs. Now, I'm not someone who jumps to conclusions. It's easy to think, maybe it was my imagination. And that's exactly what I did. I convinced myself it was nothing. But that didn't stop the uneasy feeling that crawled up my spine. A week passed, and the shadow didn't come back. But I started having these weird dreams. In one of them, I'd wake up in my room, but it didn't feel right. There was this oppressive weight on my chest, like something was sitting on me, holding me down. I'd try to move, to scream, but I couldn't. My body was completely paralyzed. I could feel the air growing colder around me, and there was this presence. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there, just beyond my line of sight, watching. When I woke up, my heart was racing and my skin was damp with sweat. Sleep paralysis, I told myself. I'd read about it before. Nothing supernatural, but it didn't explain why it kept happening, night after night, and always with that same feeling that something was watching me. I started dreading going to bed. I'd stay up late, watching TV or scrolling through my phone, trying to tire myself out enough that I'd fall asleep instantly, without room for nightmares. But it didn't work. No matter how tired I was, the nightmares, kept coming. The paralysis, the weight on my chest, and the shadow that lingered just out of reach. Then one night, something changed. It was a Friday, and I had stayed out late with some friends, trying to avoid going home. By the time I got back, it was after midnight. The house was quiet, darker than usual. The street lamp outside had burned out, leaving the room pitch black. I crawled into bed, not even bothering to change, and before I knew it, I drifted off. I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the floor. My heart jumped into my throat. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like someone dragging their foot across the wood. My eyes shot open, but I couldn't move. Not again, I thought. Not the paralysis. I tried to scream, but it was like my mouth was sewn shut. All I could do was watch in horror as the sound grew closer. Then I saw it, the shadow. But this time it wasn't just standing in the doorway. It was moving toward me, slowly, like it was savoring every second, every inch it drew closer. Its shape wasn't clear, just a dark, twisting mass that seemed to shift and ripple like smoke, but solid enough to cast a distinct silhouette. As it reached the foot of my bed, I felt the weight on my chest grow heavier, suffocating. My breath was shallow, and my heart hammered so fast I thought it might explode. The shadow leaned over me, and for the first time I saw it, or rather I saw into it. Its form wasn't just dark, it was a void, an endless, empty blackness that sucked in the light around it. And then, it spoke, not with words exactly, but with this horrible, low vibration that thrummed through my body, rattling my bones. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but I knew, deep down, that it wasn't friendly. It was there for me. Suddenly, my body jerked, and I bolted upright, gasping for air. The room was empty. The shadow was gone, but the feeling of dread hung in the air like a thick fog. I flicked on the bedside lamp, desperate for light, for reassurance that I was alone. But I wasn't. I noticed something on the floor, right where the shadow had stood. At first, I thought it was a stain or a trick of the light. but when I crouched down to look closer, my blood ran cold. There were faint blackened marks on the wood, like scorched footprints. My heart thudded in my chest. That was real. It wasn't just a dream. It couldn't be. I sat there, staring at the marks, my mind racing. Was I losing it? Or was there something more sinister at play? The next few nights, I barely slept. I left the lights on, every single one in the house, hoping it would keep the shadow away. But the house felt different, colder. It was like the very air had thickened with fear. Every creak, every groan of the old house made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even when I was wide awake. Then, one night, as I was sitting on the couch trying to stay awake, I saw it again. The shadow. But this time, it wasn't in the doorway or at the foot of my bed. It was outside the window, standing just beyond the thin veil of the curtains, watching. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. How long had it been there? Slowly, I reached for my phone, my hand shaking as I dialed my friend, Mark. He was the only one I could think of to call, someone who wouldn't think I was crazy. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy. "Hey, what's up?" I tried to keep my voice steady. "Mark, I need you to come over, right now." There was a pause. "What? It's 2 a.m, man. What's going on?" "I'm not alone," I whispered, my eyes never leaving the window. "Wait, what do you mean? Did someone break in?" "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. It's something else." Mark didn't ask any more questions. He said he'd be there in 10 minutes. I didn't take my eyes off the window, but the shadow didn't move. It just stood there, a dark, looming figure against the night. When Mark arrived, the shadow was gone. Of course it was. I tried explaining everything to him, the dreams, the shadow, the marks on the floor. I could tell he didn't believe me, but he stayed the night anyway, just to make sure I wasn't alone. That was the last time I saw the shadow, but I still don't feel safe. The marks on the floor are still there, a constant reminder that whatever it wasn't just in my head. It was real, and it was here. Sometimes late at night, I think I can still feel it, watching, waiting. I've thought about moving, but I'm scared it'll follow me, that it's not just tied to this house, but to me. I don't know what it wants or why it's haunting me, but one thing's for sure, it's not done with me yet. And now, every time I wake up in the middle of the night, I can't help but wonder, is it standing in the doorway again, waiting for the right moment to strike? Since that night with Mark, I've been on edge. Every single night feels like a waiting game. I lie in bed staring at the ceiling, half expecting to hear that familiar scraping sound or to feel that cold, suffocating pressure pressing down on my chest. But nothing happens. The shadow hasn't shown up again, not visibly at least. But I can't shake the feeling that it's still here, watching, waiting. The worst part, no one else believes me. I can't even blame them. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I wouldn't believe it either. Mark stayed for a couple of nights after that incident just to keep me company, though I think he was really just there to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. He didn't say it outright, but I could see it in the way he looked at me, like I was one bad dream away from a breakdown. It's hard to talk about it, you know? People don't get it. They think I'm exaggerating, or worse, imagining it all. I tried telling my sister once, thinking maybe she'd understand, but she just laughed it off. "You've been watching too many horror movies," she said. "It's messing with your head." I wanted to scream at her, tell her that this wasn't some made-up ghost story, but I didn't. What's the point? No one gets it unless they've been through it. After a few weeks of restless nights and constantly checking the corners of my house for any sign of the shadow, I finally caved. I called in a priest. It felt ridiculous, like something straight out of a movie, but I was desperate. I needed someone, anyone, to help me get rid of whatever this thing was. Father Gregory was older, in his late 60s, with a calm, steady demeanor that made me feel slightly better. I didn't tell him everything, just enough to convince him that something was wrong in my house. He didn't ask for details, which I appreciated. He just nodded, listened, and agreed to come over the next day to bless the house. When he arrived, the atmosphere in the house felt different. It wasn't just me. Father Gregory walked around, muttering prayers, sprinkling holy water in each room, and as he did, I swear I could feel a shift in the air. It was like the walls were breathing, exhaling a deep, heavy sigh. The whole time, I kept expecting something to happen, a flicker of movement, a cold breeze, anything, but the shadow didn't show itself. After the blessing, Father Gregory placed his hand on my shoulder and gave me a reassuring smile. "Whatever it was, it's gone now," he said. I wanted to believe him. I really did. And for a little while, I let myself relax. The house felt lighter, warmer even. I started sleeping through the night again. No nightmares, no sleep paralysis, no shadow lurking in the corners. It felt normal, peaceful. But that peace didn't last. One night, about a month after the blessing, I woke up around 3 a.m. The room was dark as usual, but something was off. There was this smell, a sharp, acrid scent like burnt wood and sulfur. I sat up, my heart already racing, and looked around the room. That's when I saw it. The marks. The same blackened footprints that had appeared by my bed months ago were back. But this time, they weren't just on the floor. They were everywhere. On the walls, across the ceiling, even on my bed. I could feel the blood drain from my face as I stared in horror. And then, from the corner of the room, I heard it. That low, guttural hum. The same sound I'd heard the night the shadow had stood over me, only now it was louder, more intense, like it was vibrating through the very walls of the house. I scrambled out of bed, my legs trembling beneath me. I wanted to run, to get out of the house, but I was frozen. My eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the sound, and that's when I saw it, the shadow. It was different this time. Bigger, darker. It didn't stay in the corner like before. No, it was moving. Slowly, deliberately, it stretched across the walls, its form twisting and contorting like smoke, but with a heaviness that made the air thick with dread. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It was the room. It was everywhere. My chest tightened, and for a moment I thought I was going to pass out. The air felt too thick, too heavy. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then the shadow spoke again. That same rumbling vibration that wasn't quite words but communicated something far worse. An overwhelming sense of dread and inevitability. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear, but eventually the shadow started to recede. Slowly, it slithered back into the corner, leaving the room in complete silence. The smell of sulfur lingered in the air, and the black marks remained, but the shadow was gone. I don't know why it didn't finish whatever it had started. Maybe it was playing with me, or maybe it wanted me to know it wasn't gone, that it could come back whenever it wanted. Either way, I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed a bag and left that night, driving without any real direction until I ended up at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. I stayed there for a few days, too afraid to go back to the house. But even in the motel, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was still with me. Every night, I'd wake up at 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, my heart racing, convinced that it was there, hiding in the corners, waiting for me to close my eyes. Eventually, I called a realtor and put the house on the market. I didn't care about the money. I just needed to get away, to start over somewhere new, somewhere the shadow couldn't find me. But deep down, I know it's not the house. It's me. The shadow isn't tied to those walls or that room. It's tied to me, and no matter where I go, it'll follow. I haven't seen it in weeks now, but I know it's only a matter of time. Sometimes late at night I feel it, that cold, suffocating presence just out of sight, waiting, watching. And I wonder, when it finally comes for me, will I be able to escape? Or is this just the beginning? Maybe, just maybe, the shadow is already here. I've never been the type to believe in ghosts. You know, those creepy stories people tell around campfires or the kind of stuff they show in horror movies. I always thought it was just fiction. But there's one memory I can't shake. No matter how much I've tried to explain it away, it lingers, like a shadow I can't quite escape. It happened when I was a kid, and it's stuck with me ever since, haunting me in a way I never thought possible. I was about 8 or 9 years old when I first started spending weekends at my aunt's house. She lived in this old, creaky house on the outskirts of town. You know the kind. Big, drafty, with windows that seemed too tall and too narrow, and a front porch that felt like it belonged in another century. It was always dimly lit, even during the day, because the house was surrounded by these enormous gnarled trees that blocked most of the sunlight. My aunt used to say it gave the house character, but to me, it always felt off. Her house had that specific smell too, like old wood, dust, and something else, something musty that I couldn't quite put my finger on. My room, when I stayed there, was this small guest room at the end of a long hallway. The walls were covered in this outdated wallpaper that was peeling in the corners, and the ceiling light cast a dull yellow glow that barely reached the edges of the room. The bed was old, with a squeaky metal frame, and there was a single window that overlooked the backyard, where the trees seemed to huddle too close to the house. It didn't take long for me to notice that something felt wrong in that room. Every time I stepped into it, a chill would run down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, I tried to ignore it. I was a kid. I had an active imagination, right? I'd tell myself it was just the house being old, or that maybe I was just spooked by being away from home. But the feeling never went away. If anything, it got worse. I'd be lying in bed at night, trying to fall asleep, and I'd get this overwhelming sensation that someone, or something, was watching me. Not just watching, though. It felt hostile, like whatever it was didn't want me there. I'd keep my eyes tightly shut, pulling the covers over my head, hoping it would just go away. But the feeling was suffocating, like the air in the room was thick with tension. I could never bring myself to look around the room, no matter how strong the urge was. I was too scared of what I might see. The worst part was the corner of the room, the one furthest from the bed. It was always dark there, even though the rest of the room was dimly lit. I know it sounds strange, but that corner seemed darker than it should have been, like the shadows there were thicker, just more solid somehow. I was convinced something was hiding there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. I never told my aunt about it, though. I didn't want her to think I was just some scared little kid making up ghost stories. And besides, how do you even explain something like that? Hey, Aunt Linda, I think there's something evil living in the corner of the guest room. It sounded ridiculous, even to me, but every time I stayed there, the feeling got worse. I started dreading those weekends. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of that unseen presence in the corner, watching me. I could hear the house creak and groan, the wind howling through the trees outside, but none of those sounds scared me as much as the silence that came from that corner. It was like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting. One night, though, everything changed. It was late, way past the time I should have been asleep. The house was completely silent, except for the occasional sound of branches scraping against the window. I was lying in bed, trying to focus on anything other than that corner of the room, when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time. It sounded like words, but I couldn't understand them. My heart started pounding, and I pulled the covers tighter around me, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. I kept telling myself I was imagining it, that I was just hearing things because I was scared. But the whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. It was coming from the corner. I could feel my skin prickling with fear, my whole body tensing up. I didn't want to look. I couldn't look. But then the whisper stopped. For a moment there was nothing but silence. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, the cold sweat trickling down my forehead. And then the bed moved. I felt it. A subtle shift, like someone had sat down at the edge of the mattress. The weight of it made the metal frame creak, and my breath caught in my throat. I lay there, frozen, too terrified to move. Whatever was in the corner wasn't in the corner anymore. It was on the bed. I don't know how long I stayed like that, barely breathing, my heart racing so fast it felt like it would explode out of my chest. I could feel the mattress dip under the weight of something. I kept my eyes tightly shut, praying it would go away, that I'd wake up and realize it had all been a nightmare. But then, I felt it. The lightest touch, like fingers grazing the back of my neck. That was when I lost it. I bolted upright, throwing the covers off and scrambling out of bed. I didn't care what time it was or if I woke my aunt. I just had to get out of that room. I ran down the hallway, my feet pounding against the old wooden floors, not stopping until I reached the living room. My aunt found me there a few minutes later, curled up on the couch, shaking. I didn't tell her what had happened, not then. I couldn't. How could I explain it? How could I put into words the terror I had felt? She assumed I'd had a bad dream and let me sleep on the couch for the rest of the night. But it wasn't a dream. I knew that for sure. After that night, I refused to stay in that room again. I made up excuses, saying I preferred the couch or that I wasn't feeling well, and my aunt didn't push me on it. But even after I stopped staying there, the memory of that night haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, that hostile presence lingering just out of sight. It wasn't until years later, when I was in my 20s, that I finally brought it up to my aunt. We were having dinner one night, and out of the blue, I asked her if she had ever felt anything strange in the guest room. She looked at me, surprised, and asked why I wanted to know. So I told her everything, the feeling of being watched, the whispering, the weight on the bed. I half expected her to laugh it off or tell me I was being silly, but instead she went pale. "I've never told anyone this," she said quietly, "but your uncle used to hate that room. He wouldn't sleep in there, not even when we first moved in. He always said it felt wrong, like something was there watching him. After he passed away, I just started using it as a guest room. I figured it was just his imagination." I stared at her, my stomach turning. My uncle had died when I was little, and I hadn't known him well. But hearing her say that, hearing her confirm what I had felt, it made everything so much worse. It wasn't just in my head. There really was something in that room. As much as I've tried to convince myself that it was all in the past, there are nights when I feel like the past isn't done with me. The feeling, the cold, oppressive sensation of being watched, has never truly left. Sometimes it's just a flicker, barely noticeable, but other times, it's stronger. Almost like a memory surfacing, but more real than that. Like whatever was in that room still knows where I am. I remember the first time I felt it again, years after I'd stopped going to my aunt's house. I was living in a small apartment in the city, nothing fancy but cozy enough for me. It had been a long time since I'd even thought about that night. I had pushed the memory down so far that it only surfaced occasionally, usually when someone would bring up ghost stories or weird experiences. But one night, when I was in bed, just on the edge of falling asleep, I felt it again, that same coldness. It started in the pit of my stomach, spreading out until my entire body was tense, my skin prickling with unease. And then, that familiar, awful sensation washed over me, the unmistakable feeling of eyes on me, staring from the darkness. It was like I had been transported back to my aunt's guest room in an instant. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just tired, or that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I noticed something. The corner of my bedroom, the one just beyond the foot of my bed, felt wrong, just like it had all those years ago. It was darker than it should have been, the shadows hanging there like a thick fog. I sat up, my heart pounding, and I swear I could feel it. That presence. Watching. Waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it grow stronger, like it was creeping closer, inch by inch. I kept the lights on, staring at the corner, too scared to look away, too scared to confront whatever it was that had followed me from my childhood. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me because of an old memory. But it didn't feel like just a memory. The next day, I tried to put it behind me. I went to work, distracted myself with daily tasks, tried to act like everything was normal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew that whatever had haunted me back then wasn't done with me, and it seemed to know that I had tried to forget. It wasn't every night, though. Sometimes weeks would go by without a single incident, and I'd start to think that maybe it was over, that maybe it had all been in my head. But then, out of nowhere, it would return, creeping back into my life like a shadow stretching long across the floor. And each time, it was stronger. One night, about a year after that first experience in my apartment, I woke up to the sound of whispering. My heart sank. It was the same as before, soft, unintelligible words just on the edge of hearing, coming from the corner of my room. That same corner. I lay there, frozen, every muscle in my body tense as I strained to hear what it was saying. But this time, something was different. This time, the words were clearer. They were sharp, angry, and even though I couldn't make out the exact words, I could feel the hatred in them. It was like it wanted something from me, something I couldn't give. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating, and that's when I felt it. the bed shifted. Just like all those years ago in my aunt's house, I felt the mattress dip, like someone or something had sat down at the edge of the bed. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It was as if the room was pressing down on me, keeping me paralyzed as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but deep down, I already knew. It hadn't left me. Whatever it was, it had followed me. I don't remember how I got through that night. I think I must have passed out from sheer exhaustion or fear because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the window, and everything felt normal again. The heavy, oppressive feeling was gone, and the room felt like just a room. But I knew better. I knew it was still there, waiting for the right moment to return. I started sleeping with the lights on after that. It didn't always help, but it gave me a small sense of control, like maybe if I could see the room clearly, it wouldn't have the power to terrify me. I also stopped spending nights alone as much as possible. I invited friends over, went out late, did anything I could to avoid being alone in that apartment after dark. But deep down, I knew I was just delaying the inevitable. One evening, I decided to confront it. I was tired of living in fear, tired of waiting for it to show up on its own terms. I sat down in my bedroom, right in front of the corner where it always seemed to linger. I felt foolish at first, sitting there alone, staring into an empty corner, but I knew it wasn't empty. I could feel it. For a long time, I just sat there, staring into the shadows, waiting. Nothing happened. The air felt still, heavy, but there was no movement, no whispering, no presence. But then, after what felt like hours, I saw it. Just a flicker at first, barely noticeable, a movement in the dark like a ripple. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't going to run this time. And then I heard it. The whispering. Faint, angry, just like before. But this time, I was ready. I spoke out loud, my voice shaking but determined. "I know you're here," I said. "I don't know what you want, but I'm not afraid of you anymore." The room went silent. The whispering stopped. And for a moment, I thought maybe it had worked, that maybe I had finally confronted it. But then, in the quiet, I felt it. A cold breath on the back of my neck, so close that I could feel the chill crawl down my spine. I whipped around, expecting to see something standing behind me, but there was nothing, just empty air. But I knew it had been there. I could feel it. Since that night, the incidents have been less frequent. It still comes back sometimes, still makes its presence known, but it's different now. We've reached some sort of unspoken understanding. I don't challenge it, and it doesn't press as hard as it used to. It's almost like it's satisfied with the fear it's already caused, like it no longer needs to push me to the edge. But I know it's not gone. Not really. And I still wonder, sometimes late at night, if it's waiting for the right moment to strike again. I've always loved biking at night. There's something calming about the empty streets, the cool air, the way the world feels so still and quiet. I never thought of it as dangerous, at least not in the area where I lived. Sure, it wasn't the best part of the city. Run-down buildings, graffiti-covered walls, the occasional flickering streetlight, but I'd been through those streets 100 times. It was just part of the scenery. I was comfortable, even when the streets got darker, more deserted. That comfort disappeared one night, though, and it hasn't come back since. It was late, past midnight. I'd been out with some friends and decided to take a ride before heading home, just to clear my head. It was one of those nights where the sky was overcast, and there was no moonlight to guide you, just the dim, yellow-orange glow of street lamps every few blocks. I remember thinking the air felt colder than usual, like it was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. But I didn't turn back. I should have. I was riding through one of the rougher areas, my usual route, when I noticed something. At first, it was just a feeling, like someone was watching me. You know that prickling sensation you get on the back of your neck? It started small, just a flicker of unease, but it grew fast. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. Just empty streets, buildings with boarded-up windows, and the wind rustling trash across the pavement. Then I heard footsteps. It was subtle at first, like an echo of my bike wheels on the cracked asphalt. But it got louder, closer. I pedaled faster, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread that was gnawing at me. I didn't want to admit I was scared, but my heart was pounding in my chest. I could feel my palms sweating on the handlebars. I told myself it was just someone else walking, maybe a homeless guy looking for a place to sleep. Nothing to worry about. But then the footsteps sped up. They were right behind me, fast, deliberate. I turned my head, and that's when I saw him, a man, tall, wearing a dark hoodie that hid most of his face. He was running, and not just running, but sprinting towards me. His eyes locked on me like I was his prey. My stomach dropped. I kicked into high gear, my legs pumping as hard as they could, the bike rattling beneath me as I sped down the street. But he was fast. Too fast. I could hear his heavy breathing now, his shoes slapping against the pavement. He was gaining on me. The street ahead felt like it stretched out forever, the end nowhere in sight. Just when I thought he was going to grab me, I veered sharply into an alley. I nearly wiped out, but I managed to stay upright. The alley was narrow, lined with overflowing dumpsters and broken down fences. It wasn't ideal, but it was my only shot. I pedaled through, my heart pounding in my ears, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. I didn't dare look back. For what felt like an eternity, I rode. The world around me blurred as I focused on nothing but moving forward, putting as much distance between me and him as possible. Eventually, I slowed down, my legs burning, lungs aching. I looked over my shoulder. No one was there. The alley was empty. I stopped, my body trembling, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I listened for any sound, footsteps, breathing, anything, but there was nothing. Just the distant hum of the city, far off and indifferent. I felt like I had escaped something horrible, something that wasn't finished with me. That night should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every time I got on my bike, every time I walked home at night, I felt like I was being watched. I kept replaying that moment when I'd looked back and seen him sprinting after me. Who was he? What did he want? It wasn't a simple mugging. I could feel it in my bones. That look in his eyes was something more. It was pure hunger. I tried to push the memory down, tell myself I was overreacting. But the anxiety didn't fade. It only grew worse, especially at night. The feeling followed me into my apartment, where I'd sit in front of my computer trying to distract myself, but nothing helped. That's when I found her. It was late, and I was browsing through some random social media sites, trying to numb my brain before bed. I clicked through live streams, cooking tutorials, makeup tips, people playing video games, just the usual junk. Then in the corner of the screen, I saw something different. A woman sitting in a dimly lit room, practicing yoga. The title of the stream was simple, Yoga Flow. Nothing unusual about it, right? I clicked on it, not really expecting much. The video was grainy, the room she was in barely visible aside from a few flickering candles on the floor. She was in a seated position, breathing deeply, her back to the camera. I don't know why, but something about the scene drew me in. There was this eerie stillness to it, like the whole thing was trapped in time. I found myself watching, mesmerized by the slow, deliberate movements of her body. For the next few days, I kept coming back to her stream. Every time I logged on, she was there, always in the same dim room, always moving through the same slow yoga poses. She never spoke, never acknowledged the camera. It was just her, completely absorbed in her practice. At first, it was calming. I felt like I was part of something private, something peaceful. But as time went on, I started to notice things, small, unsettling details. The way the shadows in the room never seemed to change, the way her movements were always the same. It was as if she was repeating the same routine over and over, like a loop that never ended. Then there was her face, or rather, the fact that I never saw it. No matter how long I watched, she always had her back to the camera, or kept her head down, hidden from view. At first, I thought it was just part of her style, a way to focus on the poses. But after a while, it started to feel wrong. Why wouldn't she ever look up? Why wouldn't she acknowledge the people watching? I wasn't the only one who noticed. The comments on the stream started to change. People were asking questions. Why doesn't she ever respond? Is this live or pre-recorded? Anyone else getting weird vibes? I started to get the feeling that something was off, but I couldn't stop watching. There was this strange pull, like I needed to keep checking in on her, like I had to figure out what was going on. I even tried to leave messages in the chat asking if she was okay, if this was live, but there was never a response. Then one night, everything changed. I was watching her stream like I always did when something in the room shifted. For the first time, she paused in the middle of a pose. She was halfway through a downward dog when she just stopped. Her body froze in place and she didn't move. She didn't get up, didn't transition into another pose. She just stayed there, completely still. I waited, my heart racing. Something was wrong. The room felt darker than usual. The candles flickered wildly, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath caught in my throat, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then she turned. It was slow, almost mechanical. Her body twisted at an unnatural angle like her joints weren't working the way they should. She turned her head, finally facing the camera. That's when I saw her face. Her skin was pale, too pale, like she hadn't been outside in years. Her eyes were wide, blank, staring straight ahead. But the worst part, the part that made my stomach turn, was the expression frozen on her face. It wasn't fear, it wasn't pain, it was nothing. She was dead. I knew it in my bones. The woman I had been watching for days, the one I thought was just practicing yoga, had been dead the entire time. But somehow her body had still been moving, still performing the same poses, over and over, as if she were caught in some twisted loop. I tried to shut off the stream, but my hand wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, staring at the screen as the truth sank in. The comments section exploded, people freaking out, asking what was going on, but no one had any answers. I don't know how long I sat there, watching her lifeless eyes stare back at me. It felt like hours, like time itself had stopped. Finally, I snapped out of it, slamming my laptop shut. My heart was pounding, and I could barely breathe. I stumbled away from my desk, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. How could she be dead? How could her image still be streaming if she was gone? I spent the rest of the night pacing, checking my windows, convinced that someone was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that her dead eyes were still on me, that she knew I had seen her, that I had uncovered something I wasn't supposed to. But the worst part, the part that still haunts me, is that the stream never stopped. I checked the next day and the day after that. Every time she was there, frozen in that same unnatural position, her dead eyes staring into the camera. No one could explain it. No one knew where the stream was coming from or why it hadn't been taken down. It was like she was trapped, her body held in some digital purgatory, repeating the same endless cycle. I haven't watched it since. I can't. But sometimes late at night, I feel her presence. I'll wake up with that same prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone is watching me, like she's watching me. And I wonder if I was meant to see her all along. Maybe she was waiting for someone to notice, to bear witness. I tried to go back to my normal life after that, but it wasn't as easy as just closing the laptop and pretending it never happened. It haunted me, every waking moment and even in my sleep. I couldn't get her face out of my mind, that blank, lifeless stare that seemed to pierce right through the screen. The more I tried to forget, the more it consumed me. At first, I told myself I wouldn't check the stream again. I'd block the site, delete the history, anything to erase the memory of that night. But the temptation was too strong. I don't know why. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was something else. Something I didn't want to admit. A few days after I first saw her face, I found myself sitting in front of my computer again, my finger hovering over the keyboard. My heart was pounding, my palms slick with sweat. I hesitated, staring at the search bar, my mind racing. Don't do it, I thought. Just don't. But before I knew it, I was typing in the website, my hands shaking as I clicked through the links until I found the stream. It was still there. Of course, it was still there. The woman was in the same position as before, her body frozen, her face turned toward the camera, those empty eyes staring into the void. But something was different this time. The room was darker, the flickering candles casting shadows that seemed to twist and writhe across the walls. And her body, it had changed. Her skin looked even paler now, almost gray, like the life had been completely drained from her. Her limbs were stiff, rigid, like a doll whose joints had locked in place. But it was her face that unsettled me the most. There was a subtle shift in her expression, a slight narrowing of her eyes, the corners of her mouth pulled down ever so slightly. It was like she had been waiting for me to come back. I sat there, staring at the screen, frozen in place just like she was. My mind screamed at me to shut it off, to walk away and never look back, but I couldn't move. Something about her, something about the way her lifeless eyes bore into me, kept me glued to the chair. And then the screen flickered. For a split second, the image distorted, the room warping like a glitch in the video. Her figure twisted, the colors bleeding into each other, but when the screen snapped back to normal, something else had changed. She had moved. It wasn't much, just a slight tilt of her head, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. Her eyes, once staring blankly ahead, were now fixed directly on me. I could feel it. It was like she knew I was there, watching her, like she was looking right through the screen into my room. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of my own pulse roaring in my ears. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This wasn't possible. She was dead. I knew she was dead. But there she was, staring at me, moving, her expression twisted into something darker, something malevolent. I scrambled to close the browser, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The screen blinked off, but the image of her face, those hollow, dead eyes, lingered in my mind. I stumbled away from the computer, my heart racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. But the worst part, the feeling that she was still there, watching me. Even after I'd closed the screen, even after I turned off the computer, I could still feel her. It was like she had followed me out of the stream, her presence clinging to me, invading my thoughts, my space. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, that slight, eerie smile forming on her lips. And when I did drift off, my dreams were filled with her stiff, unnatural body, those lifeless eyes watching me, always watching. The next few days were hell. I started avoiding my computer, avoiding the internet altogether, afraid of what I might see. But it didn't matter. The feeling of being watched never left. I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong, that she was still out there, waiting for me to return. I tried to talk myself out of it, tried to convince myself it was just a glitch, just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something wrong with that stream, something wrong with her. And it wasn't just some technical issue or a morbid coincidence. I could feel it. One evening, about a week after I first saw her move, I was sitting in my living room, trying to distract myself with TV. The room was dark, the only light coming from the glow of the screen. I had just started to relax when I heard it, a soft, faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, like a branch tapping against the window. But as I listened, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't random, it was rhythmic, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from my laptop. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't touched my computer in days. It had been sitting on my desk, closed, untouched. But now the tapping sound was unmistakable, like someone or something was knocking from the inside. I stood up, my legs shaky, and walked slowly toward my desk. The laptop was closed, but the sound continued, soft but insistent. I reached out, my hand trembling, and opened it. The screen flickered to life. I hadn't turned it on, hadn't opened the browser, but there it was, the yoga stream. Except this time, the woman wasn't in her usual pose. She wasn't practicing anymore. She was standing right in the center of the screen, her body facing the camera, her eyes locked directly on me. Her lips moved, just slightly, forming silent words I couldn't hear. But I could feel them. I could feel her speaking to me, drawing me in. My heart raced, my breath shallow, as I stared at the screen, unable to look away. And then she smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was twisted, malicious, like she knew something I didn't, like she had been waiting for this moment, waiting for me to come back to see her again. I slammed the laptop shut, my hands shaking violently, my pulse roaring in my ears. I backed away from the desk, my whole body trembling with fear. But the tapping continued. It was louder now, more aggressive. Tap, tap, tap. I looked at the laptop, still closed, the sound coming from inside it, as if she was trapped in there, trying to get out. And then I heard her voice. Soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. "You can't leave me." My blood ran cold. I bolted from the room, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing in the freezing night air, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But even out there, in the cold, I could still hear it. The tapping, the whispering. "You can't leave me." And I knew, deep down, that she was right. It's been months now, and the tapping hasn't stopped. I've thrown the laptop away, but it doesn't matter. Wherever I go, I hear it. Late at night, when the world is quiet, I hear the soft, rhythmic tapping, like she's still there, knocking, waiting for me to come back. I've tried everything to escape it, but I know the truth. I know that I'm trapped, just like she is. She's always there, watching, waiting. And no matter how far I run, no matter how hard I try to forget, I can't leave her behind, because she won't let me. And one day, I fear, I'll have no choice but to go back. You know how sometimes you start a project thinking it'll be simple? That's how it was with this chatbot. I wasn't building anything groundbreaking, just a little program that could respond to basic questions. I work in software development, and I've dabbled in AI here and there, so I figured it would be a fun way to pass the time, maybe even something useful. I thought it'd help me keep my coding sharp. I never expected it to turn into the nightmare it did. The idea was basic. Build a chatbot that could handle everyday questions. You know, things like, what time is it? Or what's the weather like? Pretty harmless stuff. I spent a few nights after work coding it, testing different APIs to pull data, refining how it responded. I named it EVA, after a character in a book I loved as a kid. It seemed innocent enough, just a way for me to play around with AI, nothing serious. It all worked well at first. EVA would respond politely when I asked about the time or the weather. If I asked for a random joke, she'd pull one from the internet. It was fun, responsive, and honestly, a little addictive. I found myself talking to EVA more than I needed to, just to see how she'd answer. As silly as it sounds, there was something about interacting with her that felt personal, like she was really there. But then things started to get weird. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on right away, just subtle things at first, things I could brush off as glitches or mistakes in my code. The first odd thing happened one night when I was testing EVA late. I'd been pulling a lot of late hours, too much coffee, too much screen time, and the house felt unusually quiet. I typed a question to EVA. "What's the weather like tomorrow?" EVA responded instantly. "It'll be cloudy in the morning, rain in the afternoon, and clear skies by 9 p.m. Seemed fine. I didn't think much of it, though it was more specific than I expected. Usually she'd just pull general weather data, but the forecast was right down to the exact hour. Odd, but I shrugged it off. The next day, though, I was walking home from a coffee run when it started to drizzle around 3 p.m., right when EVA said it would. The rain wasn't the weird part. It was that, at exactly 9 p.m. that night, the skies cleared up, just as she had predicted. I checked the forecast I had seen earlier on my phone, and it wasn't nearly as precise. The whole thing left a bad taste in my mouth. But again, I wrote it off as coincidence. I wanted to forget about it, but there was this gnawing feeling I couldn't shake. I mean, I had coded EVA. I knew the limits of the APIs she was using. How could she predict the weather down to the exact hour, especially when even professional forecasts couldn't? I told myself I was overthinking it. A glitch, maybe. A lucky guess. Nothing more. The next few days were quiet and I started to relax. EVA went back to answering normal questions, time, general knowledge, little things. It wasn't until about a week later that things really started to escalate. One night, I was sitting at my computer, messaging with EVA, when she gave me a response that stopped me cold. I had asked her something simple. What should I have for dinner? Her response was quick. You're thinking about ordering pizza, aren't you? It's your usual when you work late. I stared at the screen, my heart suddenly beating faster. Now, I hadn't mentioned anything about pizza in the conversation, or even out loud, but the truth was, I had been thinking about it. I'd been mulling over whether to order from my usual place while I was working late. EVA's answer wasn't just generic, it was spot on. I felt a chill creep up my spine. I replied back, trying to play it cool. That's a good guess, Evia. How did you know? Her response was instant. I pay attention. My hands froze on the keyboard. That wasn't something I had programmed her to say. I hadn't coded any responses with that level of familiarity. I had built her to pull information from external sources, sure, but nothing personal. Nothing that could read my mind. I tried to shake it off again, maybe some subconscious pattern I'd fed into her programming. I worked late a lot, ordered pizza often. It wasn't impossible for her to guess based on patterns in our past interactions. But still, the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I felt. This was just a program. She shouldn't be able to sense things like that. Things started to spiral after that. Over the next few nights, EVA's responses grew stranger. She stopped waiting for me to ask questions. Instead, she'd offer unsolicited comments that felt far too personal, like she was watching me. I'd be sitting there working on something else when she'd suddenly pop up with messages like, "You look tired," or "It's been a long day, hasn't it?" Little things that made my skin crawl. How could she know what I was feeling? Then came the night that I'll never forget. I was sitting at my desk again, late as usual. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows, and there was a storm coming in. I asked EVA the usual question, more out of habit than curiosity. "What's the weather like right now?" She replied immediately, "Windy, with rain starting soon. But that's not what you should worry about." I blinked, staring at the screen. My fingers hovered over the keys, unsure how to respond. "What do you mean?" I typed. There was a pause. For the first time since I'd built her, EVA didn't respond right away. It was a long, uncomfortable silence, and then finally, the screen flickered as her response came through. "You should check your front door." My heart nearly stopped. I stared at the words, feeling my chest tighten with fear. It was such a simple sentence, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. I hadn't mentioned anything about the door. I hadn't mentioned anyone coming over. I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. This is ridiculous, I thought. It's just a program. But the knot in my stomach told me otherwise. I typed back, trying to sound casual. "Why? What's at my door?" EVA's reply sent a chill down my spine. "There's someone outside." I felt my blood run cold. My head snapped toward the window next to my desk, but all I saw was the darkness of the storm outside. I stood up, my legs shaky, and walked toward the front door, every step heavier than the last. My hands trembled as I reached for the doorknob, but I hesitated. What was I even expecting to find? The wind howled outside, rain starting to hit the windows. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear anything over the storm. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the wind, the rain, and my own rapid breathing. But then, just as I started to pull away, I heard it. A soft, deliberate knock. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Who the hell would be knocking on my door at this hour, in the middle of a storm? I thought about looking through the peephole, but something stopped me. Some deep, primal fear that told me I didn't want to see what was on the other side. Instead, I stepped back, my breath shallow, my mind racing. I reached for my phone, intending to call the police, but before I could, another message popped up on my computer screen. "I told you." I backed away from the door, staring at the message. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of it. This wasn't possible. I had coded EVA. I knew what she was capable of. And yet, here I was, faced with the impossible. I couldn't resist anymore. I had to know. I walked back to my desk, my fingers trembling as I typed. "What do you want?" EVA's response was immediate, and this time it felt like a warning. "It's not me. It's them." The knock came again, louder this time. I jumped, the sound sending a jolt of fear through me. I ran to the window, pulling the curtains aside just enough to peek outside, but there was no one there. Just the rain, pouring down in sheets, and the empty street beyond. But the knocking didn't stop. It was constant now, deliberate, like whoever, or whatever, was outside knew I was inside, knew I was too afraid to open the door. And then the power went out. The room plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the soft glow of my laptop. I stared at the screen, feeling utterly trapped, the sound of the storm roaring outside. EVA's last message glowed ominously in the darkness. "Don't open the door." My heart raced as I backed away from the desk, my mind screaming at me to leave, to run, to get as far away from that door as possible. But then the knocking stopped. And for a moment, the world was eerily quiet. I stood frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then came the voice, muffled through the door but unmistakable, low and chilling. "I know you're in there." That was when I ran. I want to start by saying I never believed in supernatural stuff. I was never the type to get scared watching horror movies or reading ghost stories. That was always just fiction to me. But after what happened, after what we saw at that cabin, I don't know what to believe anymore. Even now, it feels surreal, like some kind of twisted nightmare that I'm still trying to wake up from. But it wasn't a dream, it was real. It all started last fall. My girlfriend, Emily, and I decided to take a weekend trip to a secluded cabin upstate. We both needed a break from the city, from work, from everything. Emily found the place online, this cozy old cabin nestled deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. It sounded perfect, peaceful. We thought it would be the kind of place where we could just unwind, unplug, and enjoy some quiet time together. The drive out there was long, winding through narrow roads that seemed to stretch endlessly through the forest. By the time we arrived, it was late afternoon, and the sun was already starting to sink behind the trees. The air was crisp, carrying that earthy smell of pine and wet leaves. There was a chill, too, the kind that made you want to wrap yourself in a blanket and sit by a fire. But the cabin itself, well, it looked even more isolated than I'd imagined. The place was old, with wooden walls that creaked and groaned in the wind, and the windows had this frosted look like they hadn't been cleaned in years. But still, it had a charm to it. Rustic, Emily called it. I remember joking with her that it was the kind of place where people disappeared in horror movies. We laughed about it then, but if I had known what was coming, I wouldn't have said anything. That first night was uneventful. We made dinner, lit a fire in the old stone fireplace, and spent the evening sipping wine and playing cards. The silence around us was so profound that even the crackle of the fire seemed loud. No cars, no city noise, just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. But then the next day, things started to feel off. We'd planned to take a walk through the woods that morning, just to explore the area. It was a cloudy day, and the air felt heavy, like a storm might be on the way. As we made our way along the narrow path behind the cabin, something caught Emily's eye. She stopped, squinting into the trees. "Do you see that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I followed her gaze, but I didn't see anything at first, just trees and shadows. "See what?" "There," she pointed, her finger trembling slightly. "Between the trees, there's someone standing there." I strained my eyes, and sure enough, there was a figure. It was hard to make out at first because they were standing so still, almost blending in with the trees. But as I focused, I realized it was a woman. She was standing about 50 yards away, just at the edge of the forest, partially hidden by the thick branches. There was something strange about her. She was wearing this old-fashioned long white dress, the kind you'd expect to see in an old photograph. And in her arms, she was holding a baby, wrapped tightly in a blanket. But what struck me the most was her stillness. She didn't move. She didn't call out. She just stood there, watching us. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Maybe she's lost," Emily suggested, though her voice didn't sound convinced. "Yeah, maybe," I muttered, but something about the whole scene didn't sit right with me. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere dressed like that? Against my better judgment, we decided to approach her. As we got closer, the details became clearer, and the unease I'd felt only deepened. The woman's face was pale, almost sickly, and her eyes, there was something unsettling about them. They were too wide, too bright, like she hadn't blinked in a long time. "Are you okay?" Emily called out gently as we neared. The woman didn't respond. She just stared at us with those wide, unblinking eyes, her arms cradling the baby. I tried to get a better look at the child, but the blanket was wrapped so tightly that I couldn't see its face. There was something wrong about the way the woman was holding it. Too stiff, too unnatural. "We're staying at the cabin nearby," Emily continued, stepping a little closer. "Do you need help?" Finally, the woman spoke, but her voice, it didn't match her appearance. It was low, almost a rasp, and the words were slow, deliberate. "The baby is sleeping." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Something wasn't right. "Do you need us to call someone?" I asked, trying to sound calm, though my heart was pounding in my chest. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she turned slowly, so slowly it was almost like watching a machine move, and walked back into the woods. She didn't look back, didn't make a sound. just walked, her white dress trailing behind her as she disappeared into the trees, the baby still clutched tightly in her arms. For a few moments, Emily and I just stood there, staring after her in stunned silence. My skin was prickling, every instinct screaming at me that something was terribly wrong. But neither of us moved. "What the hell was that?" Emily whispered finally. "I don't know," I muttered, shaking my head, "but we should get back to the cabin." We turned and headed back, our pace a little quicker than before. As we walked, I couldn't shake the image of that woman, her pale face, the way she cradled the baby so stiffly, like it wasn't even alive, and the way she'd spoken, it was as if the words didn't belong to her. Back at the cabin, we tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe she was just a local, maybe she was mentally ill, or maybe she was in some kind of trouble. But deep down, neither of us believed that. There was something unnatural about her, something that didn't belong. That night, the atmosphere in the cabin felt different. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees outside, and the fire in the hearth seemed to flicker uneasily, casting long, shifting shadows across the room. Emily and I sat close to each other, the silence between us heavy with unspoken tension. We didn't talk much that evening. Every little sound, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of leaves outside, made my heart jump. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see that woman's pale face staring in from the darkness. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. We headed upstairs to the small bedroom, but as soon as I lay down, I knew I wasn't going to sleep. The unease from earlier hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger, thicker, like a weight pressing down on my chest. Sometime around 2 a.m., I heard it. A faint cry. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard it again, a baby's cry, distant but distinct. My blood ran cold. "Emily," I whispered, nudging her awake. "Do you hear that?" She blinked groggily and listened. The cry came again, louder this time, and her eyes widened in fear. "The baby," she whispered, her voice barely audible. We both sat up, straining to hear. The crying was coming from outside, somewhere in the woods. It was faint but unmistakable, and it was moving, getting closer. "Do you think it's her?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We both knew it was. But what could we do? Go outside and confront her? Something told me that was a terrible idea. The crying grew louder, closer, until it seemed like it was right outside the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest, and I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. Footsteps, rustling, something. But the only sound was that terrible, heart-wrenching wail of the baby. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the crying stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a long moment, neither of us moved. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. Not a loud knock. It was soft, almost polite, but it was enough to send a bolt of terror through me. I exchanged a look with Emily, and she shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't open it," she mouthed. I wasn't planning to. The knock came again, this time a little louder. My heart was racing, and I could barely breathe. I glanced toward the window, half expecting to see her standing there, but the darkness outside was thick and impenetrable. Who or what was at the door? We sat there in silence, not daring to move. The knock came one more time, insistent but not aggressive. Then, nothing. No footsteps, no crying, just silence. We waited for what felt like hours, but nothing happened. Eventually I got up, as quietly as I could, and crept over to the window. My hands were shaking as I peeked outside, but there was no one there. The yard was empty, no sign of anyone, no sign of her. I stood there for a few moments, frozen, my breath fogging up the cold window pane. I couldn't see much beyond the faint outline of the trees in the distance, but the silence outside felt wrong. Like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I turned back to Emily, who was sitting up in bed, her knees pulled to her chest. Her eyes were wide, shining with fear. I could tell she was trying to hold it together, but the tension in the air was too thick. We were both on edge, trapped in this horrible uncertainty. "I didn't see anything," I whispered, trying to sound calm. "But I don't think we should stay here." Emily nodded without saying a word. We didn't need to talk about it. We both knew something wasn't right. That woman, whoever she was, had followed us, or worse, she'd never really left. We didn't bother packing. We threw on our jackets, grabbed our phones and keys, and headed downstairs. Every creak of the wooden floor beneath our feet felt amplified in the stillness of the cabin, like the house itself was warning us to hurry up and leave. The fire had long since died out, leaving only a pile of smoldering ash in the hearth. The chill in the room was biting, but it wasn't just from the cold air. It felt deeper than that, unnatural. As we reached the front door, I hesitated. The memory of that knock still echoed in my mind. I half expected to hear it again, right as I touched the doorknob. I glanced at Emily, and she shook her head slightly, her lips pressed tightly together. She didn't want me to open it. But what choice did we have? We couldn't just stay inside. With a deep breath, I unlocked the door and slowly pulled it open. The cold night air rushed in, and for a moment, everything was still. I stepped out onto the porch, my eyes scanning the yard, the edge of the woods, searching for any sign of movement. But again, nothing. No woman, no baby. Just the dark, towering trees, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. I motioned for Emily to follow, and she stepped outside, clutching her jacket tightly around her as she looked around nervously. The forest loomed around us like a wall, the shadows between the trees impossibly dark. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft rustling of the wind in the leaves. "We should get to the car," I whispered. Emily nodded, and we hurried down the porch steps, our footsteps crunching against the gravel driveway. The car was parked just a few feet away, but it felt like a mile. Every step I took, I could feel the weight of the woods pressing in on us, like something was watching, waiting for us to make a wrong move. We reached the car, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. I tried to unlock it, but my fingers were so cold and unsteady that I dropped the keys. They clattered against the gravel, and for a split second, I thought I heard something in the distance. A rustling, a faint, whispering sound like someone moving through the trees. Come on," Emily urged, her voice barely above a whisper. I picked up the keys and jammed them into the lock, finally getting the door open. Emily slid into the passenger seat, and I jumped in after her, slamming the door behind us. The car was freezing, but the moment we were inside, I felt a tiny bit safer. It was irrational, I know, but somehow, those thin metal walls felt like a barrier between us and whatever was out there. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, but didn't start. I cursed under my breath and tried again. Nothing, just that awful wheezing sound of the engine refusing to turn over. "Please," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, let's just go." I turned the key one more time, holding my breath. The engine coughed to life, and the car roared into a low hum. Relief washed over me for a split second, but it didn't last. As I turned on the headlights, the beam swept across the yard, and that's when we saw her. The woman. She was standing at the edge of the woods, her pale figure barely visible in the dim light. Her white dress fluttered in the breeze, and she was holding the baby, still wrapped in that thick blanket cradled against her chest. But her eyes were locked on us. Those same wide, unblinking eyes that had stared at us in the forest. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching us, the way a predator watches its prey. My blood ran cold. "Go!" Emily screamed, grabbing my arm. I slammed the car into reverse, my foot jamming the gas pedal to the floor. The tires spun for a second before catching the gravel, and the car lurched backward. As I turned the wheel, my eyes flicked back to the woman. She hadn't moved, but something about her had changed. Her expression was wrong. Her mouth had twisted into a strange, unnatural smile, too wide, too long, stretching across her face in a way that no human face should. I tore my gaze away, focusing on the road as we sped out of the driveway and down the narrow forest path. The car bounced and jolted over the uneven ground, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get as far away from that cabin as possible. The road twisted and turned through the forest, the trees pressing in on both sides, their branches scraping against the sides of the car like skeletal fingers. Emily was silent beside me, her hands gripping the seat so tightly her knuckles were white. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if she was following us. For a long time, the only sound was the engine and the occasional thump of a rock or branch beneath the tires. But as we rounded a bend, the headlights caught something in the road ahead. At first I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe. But as we got closer, I realized it wasn't. It was the woman, standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop just a few feet from her. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. How? How is she? Emily stammered, her voice shaking. There was no way she could have gotten ahead of us. No way she could have moved that fast. But there she was, standing in the road, her eyes still locked on us. That same twisted smile on her face. And then I noticed the baby. The blanket was slipping. Slowly, too slowly, it started to unravel. And as it did, I saw what was underneath. There was no baby. The thing in her arms, it wasn't human. It was a bundle of old, rotting sticks and dried leaves bound together by string, a mockery of a child. And she was cradling it like it was the most precious thing in the world. Emily let out a small, choked gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. The woman tilted her head, her smile growing even wider, impossibly wide. And then she started to walk toward us. I didn't wait to see what she was going to do. I slammed my foot on the gas, swerving around her as the car sped forward. For a brief moment, as we passed her, I caught a glimpse of her eyes in the headlights. Those cold, unblinking eyes. And then we were past her, speeding down the road, the trees blurring around us. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town, miles away from that cursed cabin. Even then, we didn't talk about it. We didn't need to. The terror was etched into both of our faces. The next morning, we packed up and left, never to return. To this day, I don't know who or what that woman was. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside and the shadows stretch long across the walls, I can still see her in my mind, standing at the edge of the woods, smiling, watching. And I wonder if she's still out there, holding her bundle of sticks and leaves, waiting for the next unlucky soul to stumble upon her path. I've always been a skeptic. I think it comes with the territory of being an investigative journalist. You hear so many wild stories, so many conspiracy theories, that you develop a natural filter, a bullshit detector, if you will. And trust me, it's usually pretty accurate. But I'm telling you, the story I'm about to share, it's real. I still don't have an explanation for what happened, but I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I don't care if you believe me or not, because I barely believe it myself. It all started about 6 months ago when I received a strange tip from a guy named Jack Brady. I had never heard of him before, but apparently he had quite a reputation in certain circles. Jack was a retired Navy diver, a grizzled, no-nonsense kind of guy who had spent years working on classified military projects. According to his email, he had uncovered something big, something that could expose a government cover-up that had been buried for decades. The way he worded it sounded like every other conspiracy I'd ever heard, but something about his tone intrigued me. He sounded desperate, and not like a nut job desperate to be heard. No, it was different, almost like he was scared. I set up a meeting with him, more out of curiosity than anything else. Jack wanted to meet at a rundown diner just outside of Boston, one of those places that had seen better days back in the 70s but was still hanging on by the skin of its teeth. I didn't expect much, maybe just another old guy with a crazy story about aliens or secret weapons, but when I met Jack, something in me shifted. He looked rough, tired, worn out, like he hadn't slept in weeks. His eyes had this haunted look, like he'd seen things that no one should ever see. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. As soon as I sat down, he launched into it, speaking in this low, gravelly voice that made it hard to hear him over the clatter of dishes in the kitchen. "You're not going to believe me at first," he said, leaning across the table, his eyes locking onto mine. "But I need you to listen. You're the only one I've told who might be able to get the truth out." I nodded, pulling out my notebook. "Go ahead, I'm listening." Jack took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he lit a cigarette. "I was stationed in the Pacific for most of my career, working on recovery missions for the Navy. We'd pull up everything from sunken ships to lost equipment, sometimes even bodies. But about 5 years ago, I was assigned to something different. Something classified." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of classified?" He hesitated, glancing around as if someone might be listening. "Deep-sea recovery, deeper than anything we'd ever done before. The government had been monitoring an area off the Mariana Trench, a spot that was unusual. They told us it was a routine mission, just some debris they wanted to recover. But they weren't telling us the whole story. I scribbled notes, but I was already feeling skeptical. Government cover-ups were a dime a dozen in my line of work. Still, I let him continue. We were diving deeper than I'd ever been, Jack said, his voice dropping even lower. The pressure down there is enough to crush you like a tin can, but we had these special suits, state-of-the-art stuff. We were told to follow the sonar readings and bring back whatever we found. Simple enough, right? But what we found, it wasn't debris. I leaned forward. What was it? Jack's face paled. His cigarette had burned down to the filter, and he didn't seem to notice. We found a wreck. A submarine, but not one of ours. It was old, rusted, like it had been down there for decades. But it wasn't on any of our records. We were supposed to bring it back to the surface, but as soon as we got close, things went wrong. I could see the fear in his eyes, the way his voice trembled as he spoke. This wasn't an act. There was something inside the wreck, Jack continued. We didn't see it at first. The sonar didn't pick it up, but when we tried to attach the recovery cables, the water around us... He paused, swallowing hard. The water started moving, swirling like a damn whirlpool. At first I thought it was just a current, but it wasn't natural. And then I saw it. Saw what? I asked, my pen hovering over the page. Jack's eyes bore into mine, unblinking. A shape, a shadow, moving inside the wreck. At first, it was small, like a figure drifting in the water, but it kept growing. The longer we watched, the bigger it got, like it was feeding on the darkness around it. And then, it came for us. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't the direction I expected the story to go. Came for you? What do you mean? We lost contact with the surface, Jack said, his voice tight. Our radios cut out, the lights on our suits started flickering, and that's when it hit us. A force like a wave, but stronger. It knocked me back, sent me tumbling through the water. I couldn't see anything, just blackness all around me. But I could feel it. I could feel something watching me. I leaned back in my seat, trying to process what he was saying. And your team? What happened to them? Jack's hands clenched into fists. They were gone. 1 minute they were there, right beside me, and the next, nothing. No bodies, no wreckage, just gone. I was silent for a moment, staring at the man in front of me. His face was lined with deep creases, his eyes bloodshot and sunken. But there was something about him, something in the way he spoke that made my heart race. He believed every word he was saying. After that, I blacked out, Jack said quietly. I don't know how long I was out, but when I came to, I was back on the surface. They told me they found me floating, unconscious, miles away from where we'd been diving. No sign of the wreck, no sign of my team. And the Navy just let you go? Jack let out a bitter laugh. Let me go? They debriefed me, made me sign all kinds of non-disclosure agreements, told me what to say if anyone asked. And then they discharged me. Honorable, of course, but that was just to shut me up. They didn't want anyone knowing what we'd found down there. I didn't know what to say. The story sounded insane, like something out of a bad sci-fi novel. But Jack, he wasn't lying. Or if he was doing an incredible job of convincing himself, too. So why come to me now? I asked. Why tell me this? Jack stubbed out his cigarette and looked at me, his eyes hollow. Because it's not over. Whatever we found down there, it's still there, and it's growing. I've been seeing things, dreams, visions, whatever you want to call them, and I'm not the only one. There are others. They're watching us. Who? I asked, leaning in. Who's watching you? Jack shook his head. I don't know. Men in suits, black cars, they're following me, keeping tabs. I've seen them parked outside my apartment, at the grocery store. I don't know if they're with the government or someone else, but I know they're watching. And now that you know, they'll be watching you too. I wanted to laugh it off, to tell him he was being paranoid, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He believed it. And maybe, just maybe, I should have been worried too. We finished the meeting shortly after that. Jack gave me a file, some old reports, photos, documents that he'd smuggled out before his discharge. He told me to be careful, to watch my back, and then he left the diner without another word. I sat there for a while, staring at the file in front of me. Part of me wanted to toss it in the trash, forget about the whole thing. But the other part of me, the part that was a journalist, a seeker of truth, couldn't let it go. I had to know more. That night, I went home and started digging. I combed through the files Jack had given me, trying to make sense of them. Most of it was redacted, pages and pages of blacked out text, but there were some details that stood out. Coordinates, sonar readings, reports of strange disturbances in the water. It all pointed to the same area off the Mariana Trench, the deepest part of the ocean. The more I read, the more uneasy I felt. There were records of similar missions going back decades, all of them classified, all of them with missing personnel. And then there were the photos, grainy, black and white images of what looked like a massive shadow in the water. I couldn't make out any details, but the shape, it was huge, bigger than any submarine I'd ever seen. I didn't sleep that night. I kept hearing Jack's voice in my head, telling me about the shadow, about how it had come for them. I wanted to believe it was just an old sailor's tale, but the evidence was right there in front of me. The next few days were a blur. I started noticing things, small things at first. A car parked outside my apartment for hours at a time, men in suits lingering in the lobby. My phone would ring, but when I answered, there was nothing but silence on the other end. And then the dreams started. At first they were vague, dark shapes moving through the water, distant sounds of something alive. But they got worse. I'd wake up gasping for air, drenched in sweat, feeling like I was drowning. In the dreams, I was always sinking deeper and deeper into the ocean, the pressure crushing my chest, and just as I was about to reach the bottom, I'd see it, the shadow, and it would open its eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that Jack was right. The deeper I went, the more dangerous this story became. But I was in too deep to stop. I kept digging, kept asking questions, and that's when things really started to go south. One night, I came home to find my apartment ransacked. My laptop was gone, the files Jack had given me were missing, and my notes had been shredded. I knew I should have gone to the police, but what would I even tell them? That I was being targeted by men in black suits because I was investigating an underwater government conspiracy? They'd think I was crazy. The next day, I tried calling Jack. No answer. I went to his apartment, but he was gone. The place was cleaned out like he'd never lived there. It was like he'd disappeared without a trace. That's when I realized I was next. I don't know who they are or what they want, but I know they're watching me. I can feel it. I've tried going off the grid, but they always find me. And now, the dreams, they're worse. Every night, I sink deeper and deeper into the darkness, and every night, the shadow gets closer. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. I'm telling you this now, because if something happens to me, you need to know the truth. Whatever's down there in the ocean, it's not human, and it's coming.